So my talk today is following a similar theme to what we've just heard, is about crown rot tolerance. And the aim of our trials were to look specifically at the relative yield performance of a number of new and upcoming varieties, both with and without crown rot. So similar sort of a vein to what some of the previous speakers have been on about at Walgett. We had 3 different sites. So one thing that we want to do in our trials is to eliminate all the variables so that the only thing that's making a difference is the absence or the presence of crown rot for these varieties. And this follows on clearly from a lot of the good work done by the DPI and the NGA back through 2007 and 2009, or to 2009, some of which has been instrumental in driving all this later research. And really what it does is just give us an early look at some of the new and exciting varieties coming through. So AGT, Longreach and Heritage put a number of varieties into these trials, some of which you've already seen, some of which you haven't. But these should be the elite lines that we will see in the next few years. So the sites, where were they? We had one up here at Wimmera, one out at Rowena, and one at Balata. One with my co-author, Drew Penberthy, his place at Lochern. So what we had to do with these, if you're trying to have the only difference being plus or minus crown rot, is try to eliminate crown rot out of the background. So we've picked sites which are commercially as clean as possible as we can for crown rot. So at Wimmera, it came out of, it was Sunbrook, went to Hattrick chickpeas back to wheat. It was the cleanest site we could find out in that part of the world. Had the Kellys over it from what we've seen with Steve. That might have just lifted the numbers a little bit, the background amount of crown rot inoculum exposure. Rowena, I mean, this is a beauty. It hadn't had crown rot in it for 5 years, hadn't had wheat in it for 5 years. Sunvale to chickpeas, went to double skip cotton that was washed out. No winter crop established in 2011, then went to wheat. Interestingly, that was still our highest crown rot site. So these things take a long time to break down. In a dry air climate, although it did have a couple of floods on it, I mean, there's still plenty of crown rot left there, having not had a wheat crop in it for 5 years. And Balata, I mean, this is a pretty good stock standard rotation for this part of the world. So it's wheat, long fallow into sorghum, double crop chickpeas, back to wheat. So you've got 2 break crops in that period, hasn't had a wheat crop in it for 3 years. One thing noticeable about it, the sites where we picked them, nice, good, deep vertisol soils. A wet summer, lots of water. 180 mils at least, 200, and we measured this one here at Balata at 217 mils of plant available water. There's the number there. So they were wet down deep underneath. And one thing that we noticed is that, exactly as Steve and Matt have said, is that it wasn't a big crown rot year. There was a lot of inoculum that we'll see in a minute, but as you can see, yeah, it was tempered by the results. The yield differences were tempered by the amount of deep stored soil water. This is an interesting slide is put up. This is a Balata taken by Drew out of the chopper near his trial sites, or maybe just west. But the only difference between that and that, it was a different crop, one different crop, had the same rotation otherwise. I mean, there's a different story. It's 2 different crops. We're just trying to investigate whether it's anything to do with the inoculum carryover or whether it's purely the water balance. From what we're hearing today, it's more than likely to be the water balance. Interesting, have a look around the trees. Shorter water, heaps more crown rot. These wheel tracks here, a bit more compaction, struggle to pick up water, more crown rot. So it's that water balance. It's
actually the same crop, but it's different variety.
Sorry, yeah. So this is all the same crop, but the previous crop was different. So that's probably the difference in the crown rot expression there is probably just a difference from the amount of water those previous crops drew out. Is that right? So this is an aerial shot of our trials. 4 reps, 14 new varieties with 5 check varieties. So the checks were Gregory, Wiley, Sunco, Bellaroy and Strzelecki. Yeah, and you can see rep 1 were paired sites just for visual observation, and then we had the other 3 reps randomly distributed for stats purposes. Okay, so what do we see in disease expression? Obviously here's our basal browning, which we score for, and that's a clean one. So the Crown Rot Index, we use the Crown Rot, we just call it a Crown Rot Index as an indication of the amount of background disease. So it's a combination of the severity and of the incidence. Incidence as a percentage, severity as a rating out of 5. So this index is a rating out of 100, which is divided, when we multiply them together, obviously you get a number out of 500, divide that by 5 to get a rating out of 100. So this blue line is the inoculum, is the expression, is the Crown Rot Index with no added Crown Rot. And it sort of bumps its way pretty well along until you get to Belleroy, where Belleroy still shows a peak in both basal browning, incidence and severity on the clean sites. The yellow line is where we've introduced Crown Rot. And the rate that we used was the 2 grams per metre, which was the high in those trials that you saw with Steve with the 0.5, 1 and 2 grams. So it's the higher rate. So the important thing to remember out of these scorings is that the least difference between them, between the plus Crown Rot and minus Crown Rot, is with Wiley, and that rating just increases till you get to Belleroy. So we'll get to Impala in a minute. I mean, it's an interesting one, but it had the least amount of Crown Rot expression next apart from Wiley. So Wiley, Impala, SunGuard, a couple more of the, so we've got the 086, the Heritage Seeds line, a group of 3 AGT lines, then Suntop. Suntop had a bit of a peak here. There was one site that it showed a bit of higher expression, both in the nil site and the plus and the added Crown Rot site. But the difference, it's there in the rating because the difference between the plus and the minus is still on that rising plane. 548, that exciting new variety we heard, the long season variety of Longreaches, the 107, Sunco here. So it's saying there that those varieties to the left of Sunco had a lower Crown Rot Index. Crusader, Spitfire, 073, Dart, Gregory, Strzelecki, and you can see it didn't show a lot of expression in the nil, really jumped when you added Crown Rot and Belleroy. So what happened to yield? So this is the yield again in the nils and the pluses. So no added Crown Rot, added Crown Rot. So the blue, Crown Rot wasn't added. Yellow is where Crown Rot is added. So there's a bit of noise, a bit of up and down here. A lot of those, there aren't significant differences between them up until about this point here, till about Gregory. Certainly, so that's Gregory there. That's Dart there. Dart's an interesting one where, in the absence of Crown Rot, did extremely well. When we added Crown Rot, started to split apart. There's Sunco, sort of a mid-range yield, but not much difference, even though the expression was slightly higher. You know, and that's where its rate was in the expression. When you added Crown Rot, it didn't really drop much yield. Same with Wiley. So the Belleroy performance, exactly the same, really dropped its bundle by 26.7%, which sort of matches some of the data that we've got with Matt when we added Crown Rot. The average bread wheat yield loss was only 2.6%, so very little, you know, varying amounts through here, and these 3 lines, these 4 lines here started to blow out a little bit. Wiley, even though it had the least expression of Crown Rot, still didn't perform yield-wise. It struggled. It was the second lowest, combined is still the second lowest yielding wheat, bread wheat, despite not losing yield to Crown Rot. So this is just a graphical indication of the actual yield loss, which is just the difference between those two lines before on the previous graph. So same thing. It's sort of, you know, we've got, must be 651A dropped a little bit. Not a lot of difference here. Get to dart. When we added Crown Rot to dart, even though the yields, the uninoculated plot yielded well, when we added Crown Rot, it dropped about 7%. Gregory, about 5. 168 dropped a bit. Strzelecki was the worst of the bread wheats, and then Belleroy. So how do they compare to Gregory? So we just rated here Gregory at 100, and this is with no added Crown Rot. So it's just another way of showing the previous data. So again, with the lowest level of the Crown Rot expression on the left, so we've got the same order as we did for the Crown Rot expression along the bottom here, from Wiley through to Belleroy. So yeah, Wiley, yeah, well down. These varieties here, to Gregory's left, have got less, they expressed less Crown Rot, but Gregory in a lot of places is up there and performing, you know, creditably with it. If I flick ahead to the next one, you can see when you add Crown Rot, these varieties just start to pull away from Gregory, which you'd probably expect a little bit, given they've got better Crown Rot resistance. A couple of the lines here, again Impala performed well. Suntop here in the presence of Crown Rot, 10% above Gregory. Sunco sort of right on line. Dart did pretty well, even though we're saying it dropped a bit of yield, it still outperformed Gregory at these sites. One thing we do have to account for in these trials is the time of sowing. You know, it's the difference in the maturity between Dart and 548 is significant. This is will be the quickest bread wheat on the market by a long shot, and that's only, you know, it's almost a Sunbrook type. It's a long season, so we do have to account for that. Grain quality, we've sort of covered this pretty well in some of the previous, with some of Matt's work. Really, it showed that screenings blew out on Belleroy, but really, not a lot of difference through here. Perhaps something there with Crusader, but otherwise pretty much online. Very similar for test weight. Really, the screenings doubled, well it's actually probably more than doubled, it's about 2.5 times when Crown Rot was added to Belleroy. And really, in test weight, no issue apart from Belleroy again. Protein, really it was only Strzelecki and Belleroy that showed anything, and that was just pretty much from, when you drop your yield, you expect the protein to go up. So there's no surprises there. So the current ratings as they stand, they're actually like a resistance rating. We're just trying to work, what we're doing is we're trying to work on tolerance, and we've got resistance ratings there. How do they work in tandem? How do they match up? And we've got to be careful because we can't be critical of the resistance ratings because that's exactly what they are. It was never their intention to be a tolerance rating. You know, we're overlaying yield on top of it, but we've still got to treat them for what they are and see whether they're serving a good purpose. And the answer, I think, is yes. So this is the New South Wales ratings, and the order here is based on these New South Wales ratings. So Wiley is an MRMS, Sungard is a provisional MRMS, down to Belleroy as a VS. There's a little bit of difference between New South Wales and Queensland, which is fair, good old state of origin. And some are provisional ratings here we're still to work on. And these are the yield results based on these trials that we've just run. And the order, when you look at it on our Crown Rot index, was pretty much, is nearly exactly that order. The only real difference was Impala. Impala on our Crown Rot ratings was sitting up here, number 2 to Wiley. on the resistance ratings, it's an MS to S, and Queensland have actually got it as an MS. So from the initial work that we did, I mean, the MS probably looks right, and maybe it should be up around here, sort of in around a Sunco type. So our comment was, and Stephen Neat's here and Steve's here, so there's others more qualified than me to talk on it, but for us, observation was it had a lower expression than the MS to S. And I suppose it also shows that how does the yield match it that way? The one thing that resistance doesn't do, it doesn't account for the inherent yield ability of a variety, or the ability of a variety to perform in the presence of crown rot. And that's what a tolerance rating would do. So we've got more work to do. One thing we've got to do, I think, is really push these trials and get them onto some 2007 type scenarios where they've really got to work hard for their water. Last year was a wet year. This year there was a lot of deep stored soil water. We're seeing good infection rates. It's not really showing out in yield. We've got to find a red ridge out towards Boomai or a really heavy sodic-y soil that a plant has to work hard to extract water. Put them on those sites and see how they go. We're keen to pursue this idea of establishing a crown rot tolerance rating system. And as I say, see how these things yield under the presence of low, medium and high crown rot pressure. We know that the Bellaroys and the Strzelecki's and the Gregory's will all shoot the lights out when you've got no crown rot. If you've got a really pristine, clean block and it's chock-a-block full of water, it just comes down to sheer yield ability. But when you put it under a medium situation, and I would tend to think that a lot of the commercial situations you would call a medium or a moderate crown rot risk. If they've had a Kelly chain over them, that's a big tick. Immediately it's a medium risk. If it's grown canola, you have a look at all the break crops are grown no-till, so there's always stubble there. If it hasn't had two break crops, then it's probably a moderate risk, especially if it's chickpeas, because you're just not getting the microbial breakdown to get rid of the disease. And if you've got a cultivation or a Kelly there, as Steve indicated, it just pushes the numbers up and pushes the risk up. Let's see how things perform in that risk, in that situation, and then test it on some high ones. So, and we need to define what constitutes low, medium, high. There's a combination of things. It's obviously inoculum level, it's soil water, starting soil water, and it all comes down to the soil type and the hydraulic conductivity of the soil to be able to deliver water to it during grain fill. What affects that? Things are probably like bulk density, the clay percentage, it might be the EC of the soil, cation exchange capacity, just tossing ideas around. So there's a mixture of physical and chemical soil attributes that would help define that as well. And how much soil water have you got there at grain fill, and how readily can a plant extract it? So, I mean, there's some good work there to be had in trying to define it. So take-home messages: if you're growing durum, beware of the crown rot risk. We've seen it, in all of these, especially Bellaroy. There are other durums that are better, but it's just a shocker. Stubble test it, still works well. A number of these new lines look really good. The Sun Tops, the Sun Guards, the Darts, the 548, some of these new lines coming through look excellent. The 08s, that 086, one of the heritage lines, looks really good in the presence of crown rot. I sort of said this, so the current resistance ratings they're a good representation of crown rot index and of yield loss, but they're not taking into account the ability of a varietal to perform in the presence of a known amount of crown rot. And we reckon there's merit in trying to pursue that and look at establishing a crown rot rating system. So just finally, I mean, the good thing is that GRDC, AGT, these three companies here contributed financially to putting these trials through and putting their lines in, and they, by that, they continue to demonstrate their willingness to breed for better Crown Rot varieties in the presence of Crown Rot. So we take our hat off to them, you know, and trying to drive high yields. And you look at the performance of those where Sunco was a real mark in the sand. We're starting to get lines that are better than Sunco, so that's a good thing. So just my acknowledgements. These companies with all their logos, but I'll leave that there for a minute and thank them for their support. Thanks, John.
Thanks, John.